Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and I want to thank you all for tuning in. What I'm going to do today is talk about the origin of Leks, and more specifically, what dwarf tyrant mannequins can tell us about that origin. I want to know about Leks when they first originated way back whenever. I'm particularly interested in the origin of male aggression, male aggregation or clustering, because I think it's fundamental to identifying a unifying theory of Lec evolution that will encompass all groups of Lecking organisms, birds, mammals, fishes, insects, whatever. Now, when we are talking about male aggregation or clustering, we hear a lot of talk about female preference for clustered males. But I think it's important to remember that a female preference for clustered males is really a maintenance factor rather than an origin factor. Because you see, for females to prefer clustered males, the clustered males had to already exist so that they could prefer them. What this means is that male clustering had to have originated independent of female preference and before the development of female preference. And that is the issue that I want to address. And we're never going to know with certainty what the conditions were when Leks first evolved and male clustering first occurred. However, I do believe that if we select species to study very carefully, then we can come to gain some insight into how clustering evolved. I think the dwarf tyrant mannequin is one of those species for two reasons. First of all, has to do with its evolution, its occurrence. Here is a phylogenetic tree from Leti et al., recently published, excellent work. And what you'll see is that early in the evolution of the mannequin family, there was a dichotomy that resulted into two very unequal clades, an extremely large core clade, which encompasses all the species of mannequins that we think of as, quote, typical mannequins. They have elaborate displays. They have very brightly colored males and extreme sexual dimorphism. In contrast, the other half of this dichotomy includes a small clade, many fewer species, Tyranneutes, represented by the green arrow. Interestingly, these species tend to have simple displays. They're not morphologically sexually dimorphic. Males and females look just like each other. And males do not have a brightly colored plumage. Now, the importance of this is that one can argue that, in fact, the members of this clade retain more ancestral features. And therefore, by studying their behavior, we may be able to glean some information about what the behavior of the ancestors was like. The other reason for studying this species is their pattern of male dispersion. All males who are reproductive in this species occupy courts. Some of those males occupy solitary courts. That means that the court has one male present, and also that his court is isolated from other males. It is some distance away. As far as I can tell, there's no interaction between them. On the other hand, there's another part of the population of reproductive males in which the males cluster into small leks of 2 or 3 or maybe 4 individuals. These clusters are long-term. They may persist for years and years. They are a regular occurrence in the population, and in any given year, somewhere between 6% up to 30% of the entire population is clustered. Now, what I thought was that if I could compare the traits of the males and characteristics of the courts of solitary individuals with male traits and court characteristics of clustered individuals, I might be able to identify factors that led to clustering and explain why particular males clustered together. So that is what I'm going to show you the results of today. Now, just a brief, some brief remarks on the dwarf tyrant mannequin. As I said, you can see he is green, the quintessential little green bird that sits in the vegetation and is hard to locate. The species occurs over most of northern South America. I studied it at the Cochacashu Biological Station in Manu Park in southeastern Peru, the little red dot. The birds there occupy the understory of mature forest. It can be lowland floodplain forest or upland forest, and they are frugivorous. With regard to their behavior, I want to give you a few more details. Again, we have the solitary and lek males. All these males, as I said, occupy a court. It is a small court within which there is a smaller, maybe 1/10 of a hectare, internal core area, which is the place that they spend most all of their time, where they advertise their presence to attract females. As I pointed out before, solitary males have no vocal interactions. Clustered males, in contrast, do interact vocally, antiphonally, all the time. So one male calls, the next male calls, the next male calls, the first male calls again, and you just go back and forth, round and round. It is coordinated, it's rhythmic, it's continuous, it's almost metronomic at some times. So these birds are interacting with each other. They're not just close to each other, but they interact. Now, a couple of notes on Lec Formation. The leks start out with a single male, a solitary male. At some point, that male is joined by another male, one male or 2 males, and I call them joiners because they have obviously joined the first male. I call the first male a hotshot because one can hypothesize that a joiner male would be most likely to join with a male that is the most successful, that gets the most responses from females, is most successful at mating. Therefore, I have arbitrarily assigned him the hotshot role and the joiners a lesser role, assuming that they are less successful than the hotshot and the solitaries. All right, now how did I look at aggregation in these birds? Well, there's one major dichotomy, first of all, in male aggregation. There's passive aggregation, in which males simultaneously but independently respond to some external stimulus, and as a result of that response, end up at the same site at the same time, totally indifferent to the presence of other males. It's a coincidence that they happen to be together. It may be a place where there are lots of females, so they all go there for the females without paying attention to what anyone else is doing. There's also active aggregation, in which a male actively seeks to associate with another male because of the benefits that may accrue to him as a result of the association. This would be true if a less successful male was to associate or join a more successful male so that he could learn tips on successful displays, successful calls, or if the male was quite successful, the joiner could intercept some of the females that the hotshot was attracting. Okay. Let's first look at passive aggression. There are two hypotheses that are extant as explanations for passive aggression. The resource limitation hypothesis suggests that some resource, mainly that males need, is limited. And so they have to share the resource if indeed they're going to have access to it. So it may not necessarily be that the resource itself is limited, but the number of places in which it occurs is limited. So they all have to go to the same place to take advantage of it. Now I tried to think what resource could be limited for males. And the only thing I could come up with was court sites or display sites, whether or not there was some special plant or branch or something that made it particularly good display site. And so males had to congregate if they were going to have access to it. So what we did is we went to the core areas of the courts, and we simply took habitat measurements, the routine normal things such as canopy cover, ground cover, shrub abundance, number of lianas, and that sort of thing, hypothesizing that the hotshot males would have the best courts for whatever reason, even if we didn't know what that reason was. And so that would mean that hotshot courts would be different from the courts of solitary males, because obviously a joiner is going to join the male with the best spot. So we compared the characteristics, habitat characteristics of the courts of joiner males, hotshot males, solitary males, to see if we could identify differences. We also compared them to a number of control courts, which were randomly selected points in the forest, to see if indeed the hotshot courts differed also from the controls, suggesting that court sites were limited. The second hypothesis, the focal attraction hypothesis, suggests it is more concerned with females and suggests that they are attracted to some spot for a particular reason, such as a very large feeding tree. You might not expect a large feeding tree to be all over the place. And so the females would congregate there and the males would congregate there because the females were there. Well, to test this, we looked at the food plants that were most important to this species and found that there were a couple of species that form about 85% of the diet. So we set up plots around each court, and they were large plots, the size of the courts, to count how many plants of these three species were present in the courts of males that were solitary, joiner, or hotshot. Again, hypothesizing that hotshots would have the greatest number of these plants in his court, followed then by solitary males. And again, we set up control plots and hypothesized that they would have the fewest number of individuals of these plants. Well, let's look at the results. These are this is the habitat analysis of the core areas of the male courts. You see on the left the things that we looked at: canopy cover, ground cover, lianas, etc. These numbers you don't have to worry about, but on the right hand, there is a column which gives a probability value. These are all means. We compared the canopy cover in plots of controls, solitary, joiner, and hotshot males. And what we found out is that there was no difference in the average values for the categories of males and the controls. And every single character we looked at, there was no significant difference among any of them. So it didn't appear that something was in short supply, at least not as far as courts were concerned. Here are the results from the focal fruit tree sampling. And again, we compared the three categories of males and a control site. This is the first species. The mean values on the courts are approximately the same. They certainly are not significantly different. Here's the other species that's important. Again, the numbers, there's no significant difference between the abundance of these plants on the different categories of courts. If anything, you'll notice that the controls tend to have more of these fruit plants than any of the courts do. There's also another thing I want to point out, and that is that a number of the courts, you see these numbers here, have no individuals of these important fruit species. And likewise, a number of the courts we sampled had none of these important fruit species. That goes along with the fact that males on Leks tend to not supply resources to females. The most striking line is the bottom. This is the number of courts we sampled, which have neither Lunania nor Cusipoa on the courts. And you see that 5 of 18 courts of solitary males didn't have either of these plants. So again, it doesn't appear that a focal food in any event is driving where males put their courts. All right, what about active aggression? We only considered one hypothesis, the hotshot hypothesis, which simply says that less successful males are clustering around more successful males to learn from them or to intercept females. Well, Obviously, what we would want to do is compare the number of matings. And we would presume that less successful males would cluster around a hotshot male that was getting lots of matings. But we don't have data on that. So we tried to think of what else could we look at in a male? What signal might tell us who was a hotshot and why? And since males advertise for females by calling, and since males have no bright plumage and no morphological modifications, we thought, well, what is it about the calls that might make a hotshot? One thing they looked at was call frequency, the number of minutes, the number of calls per minute that a male makes. The other was call persistence, which is the number of minutes a day it calls, hypothesizing that the more you call, the more likely you are to attract a female, simply because there's more opportunity for her to hear you as you are passing by. So again, we compared the call frequency and call persistence among different groups of males. And this is just so you can hear this wonderful sound that goes on all day. Okay. Calling by different categories of males. Again, your solitaire, joiner, hotshots. Calls per minute, approximately the same, but it did show a significant difference with an ANOVA. So we then reanalyzed the data with a Tukey's Q test. What we determined, in fact, was that the solitary and joiner males, who are the extremes, were significantly different. Their mean number of calls, joiners was significantly lower than solitaries. That's not a surprise because we assumed it was the less successful males that joined the other males to make a lek. In terms of the number of minutes per day calling, again, there were differences. The solitary male called the least, interestingly, then the joiner, then the hotshots. Probability that they're the same was more than 5%. I mean, the significance level was at 0.08. But since that's relatively low, we also ran a Tukey's Q test, and it showed that solitary males and hotshot males differed significantly, but neither differed from the joiner males. I want to point out one other thing, which is of interest, but perhaps not directly relevant. The leks on a lek, when you combine the calls of joiner and hotshot males, you end up with almost double the number of calls per minute. And you end up with a big increase in the number of minutes per day that somebody is calling from that lek, 93% of the day. Okay, now, there is a problem with these data that I want to mention briefly. It's a problem that we did not identify until after we had finished our sampling. We need to go back. What we found is that individual birds, when recorded, when their call count data were taken, individual birds changed according to their status. So here is a solitary individual that was sampled in 2 different years, calls per minute, there's essentially no difference. The minutes calling increased, but of course you can't just compare two numbers. We had a joiner male who in a subsequent year became a solitary, and what we found was his calls per minute went up. And they went up, the increase was, the two means were significantly different. Likewise, we had a solitary who became a hotshot, and his call rate went down, probably because of the contribution of the joiner. And here, again, the differences are highly significant. So when we come back, go back and look at these numbers, we don't know what they mean, because the hotshot indeed may have been calling way more than the solitaries when they were solitary. But with the presence of a joiner, they may have decreased their rate of calling. So what we have to do is know how everybody called as a solitary, and then see among those who became a joiner and who became a hotshot. Okay, what are the conclusions of all this? I think passive aggression is not likely to have been a driving force, or there was no evidence of any resource limitation. Some courts didn't even have the resources present. There seemed to be multiple resources available among the controls. And so I don't think that's a driving force for male clustering. Active aggregation is more likely. But as I said, we need more research on vocalizations. Thank you.